cough drop. And, you know, it's been one of the most amazing experiences. I'm hopeful that Regina will join us because Regina was my buddy, and she and I we're kind of like keeping each other honest and getting ourselves across the finish line. So that was so critical to do. So if there's anything that I can do for those of you who are in the process, please reach out. It can be really isolating, and so I was super grateful to have Regina in that process. I am working now in healthcare. I was in healthcare when I did the dissertation and picked the topic, and I was working in an executive role. And yes, I am stalling a little bit because PowerPoint's jumping up and down on my computer and the color wheel's going. So I'm just going to do some lead-in.
If you need me to, I'll pop it up.
Would you? That would be great.
Yeah, so go ahead and talk a little bit.
Okay. So I was working in a role in healthcare, and in a role of Vice President of Culture and Talent Planning. And I had been in that role probably about 18 months when I chose my topic. And one of the things that I had observed kind of moving into that culture realm were a couple of things. I had observed the difference in culture at the director level and at the VP level. It was almost like everything I had learned as a director didn't apply in the VP world. Of course, my first day on the job was doing a budget, so that was not the best way to start it. But I observed a very big difference in the way the executives interacted in the executive team, and also in the types of conflicts that were coming up. I also observed, oh, yay, I think I've got, well, did you bring that up, Deanna, or did I?
No, I think you did because mine's just now coming up.
Okay, so I finally opened, so I can do that now on my end. So should I go ahead and
Yep.
share my screen?
Right ahead.
Okay, yeah. And when everyone tells me they've got it, then we can.
I think it's there.
Yay.
Yeah.
All right. So, so I became interested in a couple of things. I became interested in the kinds of value dilemmas that were presented at the executive level in healthcare. And I became interested in what the ego does to respond to them. And early on, struggled with how I would look at ego. And so looked in the literature around definitions of ego and a model. And this is where Nancy said, you know, if you really want to look at this, why don't you use a subject-object lens to understand ego? So that's how this whole kind of conglomeration came together: value dilemmas and identity formation in healthcare executives. It's a collective case study using a subject-object lens. So this is the constructive development model. For those of you who know Keegan and have struggled through his books as I did, his model is basically attractive because it does a couple of things. It provides a map for how we need to continue to transform and grow as adults, and not a lot of developmental theory does that. And it also gives this wonderful way of showing how the way we think and our capacity for thinking needs to evolve as we are leading ourselves and leading other people. And this map that shows kind of 3 levels are 3 of the 5 levels of his constructive development theory, starting at level 3, which usually developmentally happens around teenage years, the socialized mind, which is somebody who is able to identify themselves through this concept of mutuality, like I am as others experience me. Then that shifts into this piece of the self-authoring mind, which is, you know, I am as I experience myself, value-driven, problem-solving, etc. And then the third kind of transformation is the self-transforming mind, which is I am as I am existing in relationships in a complex system. And so, this was the model, and it gave me a way to look at this concept
Leslie,
of identity.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
Mhm.
could you click on sharing the presentation again? I'm not seeing
Oh,
anybody else seeing it.
you're not seeing it. Okay. Sorry about that.
And I don't know really. Do you see it, Charles? Okay.
So tell me, did you see it until I put it in slideshow view?
No, I'm not really sure what happened.
Are
I
you
was
seeing-
able to see it. It was working okay on my end.
Same
Are you-
here. I could see it fine.
Okay, good. Maybe it's just me. Go ahead, Leslie. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Is anyone, are you seeing it all now but minimized? And are you seeing it at all, Deanna?
No, but go ahead if everybody else can see it.
So I will just reference this, since you have my deck, I will just reference, I'm on the first slide that says why important to me.
And now I'm seeing it again, so I'm good.
Yay, okay, good. So so that's the why for me. I wanted to understand the executive experience. I wanted to understand it from a developmental lens, and I wanted to learn more about what was going on with myself, to be honest. And everybody said your dissertation is some extension of yourself, so that's the honest part of it. So my specific research questions around this were, and so my overall question was, how do value dilemmas in healthcare inform an executive leader's construction of meaning and identity? So it did two things. It assumed that the executive was experiencing value dilemma, and then what it was really seeking to understand is, how do they construct meaning about that? And in looking at how they constructed meaning, what did that say about their lens developmentally? So their sub-questions were kind of, what's the content of the value dilemma? Because I was interested in knowing what types of dilemmas executives were going to be dealing with, what meaning was being constructed, what did that say about the stage of identity development. And when I showed you the Keegan scale, I didn't even consider that I would see something below a level 3. Because that becomes like level 2, impulsive, pre-adolescent. And no matter what anybody thinks they have seen in executive leadership, I've never seen anybody operating at quite that level. Well, actually, I might need to take that back. Anyway, and then the next question was, what stage of identity development was evoked by the way they were constructing meaning, and what commonalities and differences were there across participants? Here were some of my key assumptions. My assumptions were that by looking at value dilemmas, that they would mirror the kind of complexity that exists in healthcare today, and that they would be useful illustrations of the context that executives operate in. And I don't know how many of you read, I can't remember if it was my NPR scroll or my Apple News scroll, but I was just reading one of those this morning saying that the top reason that CEOs are leaving organizations are because of ethical or moral breaches. Did anybody see that this morning? So I thought this is a very salient topic for characterizing a part of the executive world. Another assumption I had was that value dilemmas would evoke stories that would show this thing that Keegan and Leahy call, or Keegan specifically, subject-object dynamics. And what subject-object dynamics are the things that as an individual you can objectively understand and take perspective on. Those are the object dynamics. And the things that are deeply held assumptions or beliefs that you are subject to but not aware of. And those are the subject dynamics. And another assumption I had was that I could use a subject-object lens for analysis of the executive's narrative, and that would help me understand better their developmental stage. A fourth assumption was that that lens would allow for an epistemological view across participants. Although I was really clear, and Gary helped me get really clear, this wasn't about categorizing or labeling executives. It wasn't an assessment exercise. And then the last assumption was that participants would be at level 3 and above. And that's why when I showed you the scale, I only showed level 3 and above, because you couldn't be in the study unless you were willing to talk about a value dilemma that you were dealing with. And the formulation of values would imply that somebody was at least at a level 3. Should I stop there and answer any questions?
You can. Anybody have questions? Everybody's on mute, so you'll have to unmute yourself if you have a question. And then also I want to remind everybody, if you think of references or think of thoughts, please use the chat room and we can share the chat box information later too. So,
Okay.
Questions, anyone?
Yeah, I have a question for Leslie. When I was seeing the slide where you said you sort of wanted to delve into your own assumptions, did you actually fill out the immunity map?
What I did, so the way I looked at the subject-object dynamics is that I got a coach to take me through a very accelerated quasi-certification in subject-object interviewing. And it's different than the immunity map.
Okay.
So the subject-object interviewing gives you a stage identification for where someone is in the evolution of how they make meaning using the Keegan model. There's overlap with immunity, but it's different. And actually, Kay was a volunteer. Kay, if you're on and you want to talk about it, she was a practice person for me so that I could practice my subject-object interview and practice the scoring process of it. And then to answer your question, I did, Marty, I did actually have somebody interview me who was not the coach that was teaching me how to do it so that I could control for my perception. Because one of the things that bothered me the most was, I know I'm not a 5. About, I guess, 1% of the population is. I'm working on it. And how would I even recognize it, because I'm not. So, that was one of my concerns. I think fortunately or unfortunately, nobody in my sample was at that level either, so I didn't have to deal with that as a source of error. But I did get interviewed. I did get coached. I used the subject-object interview.
Cool.
Kay, do you want to say, do you remember that interview? Do you, as a participant, do you remember anything about it that you would want to share?
I do. It was very insightful for me. Like, I learned a lot more about myself that I hadn't taken time to reflect on. Specifically, more deeply what my values are and how they show up. And how I tap back into them, just day to day. Yeah, it was enlightening. It felt really safe to be interviewed about such, intimate topic. I think I got a little bit emotional at one point when I remembered a time when I knew distinctly that my value was formed and solid around a particular area in my work. So that was surprising, but also encouraging. Yeah. To be really useful.
Thanks, Kate. So here's some particulars about the design, who the participants were. I recruited through LinkedIn and through my network, and I asked people if they would participate or if they could refer anyone. I got 7 of these 8 participants directly from my network, and I got 1 as a referral where somebody I knew said, I think I know someone who would participate in this. And so you can see they were at a chief or a senior VP level, either in Texas, California, Florida, North Carolina, New Jersey. So they were pretty spread out. There were 6 female, 2 male. All were Caucasian. And half of them were in flux. So meaning they were in transition. The CEO was finishing a commitment to stay, but had already announced a resignation. One of the SVPs had recently retired, was in the first year of retirement. So not everybody was actively in their role. And I think that's why I was able to get as many as I could, because it was a 90-minute time commitment, which is really hard to do. So it was complicated, as Gary pointed out. It was a complicated design because I was looking at 2 things at the same time. I was looking both at the context, which is tell me about the dilemma and how you resolved it. And I was looking at their experience. So how did you experience yourself in the dilemma? Like, how did you construct meaning out of the dilemma? And then that required that I use 2 different ways of analyzing the content. So to look at context, I looked at the input and I broke it down by what kind of assumptions were operating, what the dilemma was, what values they referenced, what actions they took, and what impact there was to themselves. And then when I looked at their experience, I had a really great tool in the subject-object interview because it's a very strict protocol. So when you score subject-object interview, which to just describe it, the way you do it is you ask somebody to reflect on situations where they've experienced like 10 different emotions: glad, sad, I can't even remember them right now, but you overcoming a difficulty, and you give them those prompts, and whatever comes to mind they write about, and then you ask them questions as they describe these incidents, and they get to direct it. So the way that it worked in the interview was I first asked them to talk about a value dilemma. Can you describe a value dilemma? And what was the dilemma? What were you thinking about it? Why was it a dilemma for you? What action did you take? How did you feel afterwards? Was to give a good description of context. And then I asked them, in thinking about that dilemma, choose from these emotions. And we went into this whole description of the experience. And so let's talk about it. What was at stake for you? Why was it important? And using that subject-object interview, was able to kind of see how they were constructing meaning about themselves in the context of their dilemma. This was not a traditional use of the subject-object interview, and there are some studies that said it was okay to do, that said you can look at use the subject-object interview across different contexts.
Leslie, before you move on, can you say just a word about kind of your working hypothesis going into the study, why it was that you chose to look at these kind of dilemmas?
So I looked at these dilemmas because I thought they were really critical in how we formulate identity as leaders. And my original topic that I wanted to do was a compassionate examination of ego in healthcare executives, because it struck me how, as an executive, you are, simultaneously forced to take like very clear, value-based direction, and the system looks to you for that kind of ego strength. And at the same time, all of the things we're trying to do in leadership development is to, let leaders kind of distance themselves from all of those ego needs and be more of a servant leader, etc. So my working hypothesis was that as long as executives are stuck in dealing with value dilemmas, I have to defend the organization. I have to defend my people, from the the challenges that are happening in the marketplace, or I have to fight these battles between people and profit, or I have to be the one who buffers them from the threat that's out there. As long as they're in that kind of mode where they have to be fighting these value-based battles, I didn't think it was realistic to expect them to be able to kind of transcend ego, which is sort of what that 5th stage of development looks like. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Sure. So here's what I found. I found that there were 3 main things. All executives were stage 4. So I sort of want to go back and use this to remind you what stage 4 looks like. It's the self-authoring mind. And when you do subject-object interviewing, it gives you kind of like, I'm steady at that state, so I'm a solid 4, or I'm evolving to that state, or I'm transitioning from that state. So everyone was a 4, with some people still evolving, meaning there were remnants of this socialized mind in the way they talked about things. So that sounds like somebody who's like clear about their values and clear about what they're wanting to do, and still really dependent on like a boss to validate that it's the right thing, or really feeling like their identity is threatened if they can't fix this issue, because they are so invested in the approval of others. And then some folks were sort of transitioning out of that, which is like able to take some perspective, but not enough perspective to say that they really saw how they were in a system, like that it was that they were part of the problem. In other words, nobody was able to fully move there and say, sure, I'm defending this, and I see why. And I also realize that that's part of the dynamic, that I have to be in this ego defensive mode, is evoking a whole bunch of other things. Nobody said that, which would have maybe bumped them up to the next level. So I wanted to show that graphic again, because I think it's hard to keep some of these pieces straight. So they were either evolving or transitional at self-authoring stages, and that those who were kind of evolving, what you saw in their narrative was that they took these dilemmas much more personally. It was more about like, am I good? Do I have what it takes? Why don't people trust me? Much more personal themes. Or they were more dependent on sponsorship to resolve the dilemma, and that sponsorship could have been board sponsorship or their boss, their CEO. And they were more likely to have their self-image as a leader depend on that support. So like if my boss or my board or my team believes in me, I must be good. The executives who were at a really stable self-authoring stage when compared to the folks who were evolving or transitioning did see their dilemmas as more systemic and complex. And Keegan calls this evolution, it's an increasing capability for complex thinking. So they saw their dilemmas as more systemic, more complex. They were more likely to be able to think in a way that integrated complexity. So I came up with a couple of phrases to talk about how they integrated them. And Gary, you teased me about one of them because I spelled it wrong, but it was like, how do I integrate the need to protect my people with the need to, drive profit or something. And I think I don't even remember, I should have gone back to my paper, but I came up with some name like the benevolent steward or something like that, but I spelled it wrong. Gary said, I didn't know what you were talking about. I thought maybe you were I spelled it Stewart. He said, you must be making a reference to Martha Stewart. said, nope, just with a spelling error. But they were able to take these, what would seem like, polarized forces and come up with a role that integrated them better. And they were also more likely to reference like who they were, their identity, as a way to respond to it. So it wasn't about like how you fix these challenges systemically. It was about what I do. I have the power, I have the value system, I have the leadership. It's my job, tremendous sense of responsibility to fix it. None of them were at the fifth stage, the self-transforming stage. And what's so interesting is, as we talked about value dilemmas, what seemed to happen is sort of the kind of a cyclical relationship between the value dilemma and the identity formation. So it's like the more they talked about value dilemmas, the stronger the commitment to the values came. And the less likely in language or in any way were they to challenge their ideology. So it's like the more I have to defend my values in the system, the stronger my self-authoring is going to be, the more I'm, the less likely I am to step back and look systemically at it. So this was just a summary to look at what the dilemma themes were across the different respondents. The key themes were all of them, except one, told stories where they were in a dilemma around, profit versus people. This was the one piece I wasn't expecting at all. And I don't know if anybody else has come into this, but, the stories were really upsetting to hear. So I'll just give an example because it's all, anonymous. One person talked about Medicare fraud, and one person talked about the pressure in a not-for-profit, faith-based healthcare system to lay off 800 people so that 2 executives could get their bonus. These were really hard to listen to. At some point, I thought, wish I should have been an investigative reporter because, I just want to write all of this up. So I would stop there. I don't know if anybody else has come into that sort of a situation. That was something I was not expecting at all. Any comments from others?
This is Deanna, and that doesn't surprise me at all. It's like the whole profit versus people. That's what I experienced in healthcare.
Yeah.
And the discussion I had with my participants in my research, the reason they got out of traditional medicine, and that was providers, that was people providing care, is because of this issue. And they couldn't provide the care they had envisioned providing because of the drive for the profit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it was like the gist of it was like we're saying to executives, like, come on, transcend your ego, and and at the other end of it, they are fighting fights. I mean, what really was touching to me, and I can't generalize across all healthcare executives, just the ones that I spoke to, is hugely committed to mission, really feeling hugely responsible for the implementation of that mission, for the sacred nature of the work that they were doing. And so these dilemmas were really painful for them, to be dealing with.
Let's see. I'm sorry. I don't know if you saw I don't know if you can see the chat box. Marty had put in a question.
Oh, I can't.
Okay. So, well, Marty, why don't you ask the question? And I don't know if you want to deal with this now or later, Leslie, but
Okay.
I found it to be a really intriguing thing that we discussed, in your defense call.
Okay.
So yeah, my question is, why do you think there were no executives at level 5, and what does that mean for their organizations?
Yeah.
I've been doing a lot of reading. I've been looking into constructive developmental theory as well, because it plays right into transformative learning. And of course, Keegan famously claims that only 1% of adults ever get to level 5, which is frightening.
Right.
Because that's the level at which we need to be thinking in order to address our complex issues in a global society. So when you said that, I was kind of like, not surprised, but heart sinking.
Yeah. And I agree with you. I'm going to talk of this was Nancy's challenge to me. It's like, why? And so I think the why about not being at 5 developmentally is a statement of the system dynamics. And I'll show you a slide at the end that kind of characterizes it. But what I walked away with was a snapshot of, looking at these dilemmas and seeing how these dilemmas really forced an executive to continue to access that self-authoring framework. It's my values, my identity, because I'm fighting these systemic forces. So I'm a daughter of 2 psychologists. I think psychologically, but it seemed very much like a defense mechanism. And it also seemed like how could you stop doing that? I mean, you're in battle. So how are you going to stop using that frame of reference because you're in battle conditions, So I'll talk a little bit more about that. I felt the same way. And I felt a wee bit relieved around that because, again, I was concerned that I wouldn't know a 5 if it bit me on the nose. And I will tell you, just from those of you who are doing this, the process I used was my coach also independently scored all the interviews. So I did inter-rater reliability measures just to make sure, because I was on a learning curve, and she confirmed where they all were as well.
Wow.
Thanks. Yeah.
Leslie, I think that was the question for me, and I was waiting to just see if, and you may get to this later, but that bridge from the narrative to the analysis. And it's easy to go through and find the themes for what their dilemma was, but how and you probably are going to talk about this, but how did you actually score that as far?
So again, I was scoring things. There were 2 scoring methods. So this is a summary grid to show. I did, I coded and I tracked the themes, and I then started to look at how how the narrative related to the themes. So like it is example, just when it comes to the dilemma, if you look under profit, 7 out of 8 had a people versus profit element to their narrative, and only 1 of them had a positive example, so where they were able to negotiate that where they felt positive about their ability to negotiate it, and so that's how I looked at the context. When I looked at their meaning making, the Keegan, there is a really amazing book, if anyone's interested, by Lisa Leahy and 4 other authors, that walks you through the subject-object interview. And I had to read it even before my coaching started. So it's a really clear protocol on how to score it. And you can get certified. Once a year, they offer a certification. My coach is, am I allowed to mention her name? I think so. I know that Sayrick doesn't want anybody's names in the paper, but her name is Annie Howell, and she teaches the subject-object certification. And, they're all connected through Minds at Work, which is Keegan and Leahy's kind of consulting arm. So it's something that if you're interested in learning, you can learn it by reading the book and doing the practice scorings. there's articles on what they call an autodidactic way of learning it. So some folks have published articles saying you can teach yourself to do a subject-object interview and you don't even need a coach, and they outline it. So there's lots of different ways to learn that protocol. And if anybody's interested, I would, ping me or just let me know, and I would be more than happy to like share all the references around it. So this wasn't the meaning making. This was just what dilemmas. And again, my belief, my assumption was these dilemmas would be quite illustrative of the context or the environment that that healthcare executives are working in. So the net of it was the environment was characterized by high power distance. Very profit motivated, very short-term focused, and quite hierarchical. And for those of us who work in healthcare, that's kind of like, oh yeah, I know. And part of the structural challenges, like, look, you implement, you don't challenge. If it comes above you in the hierarchy, you do it, whether you think it's right or not. We are, whether we're not for profit or for profit, we're all for profit. And that pressure, even though we're not, a traded organization, I didn't talk to any tenant or HCA, for profit kind of environments, but even though we're not for profit, we're still operating with these annual numbers, not so different from for-profit organizations, whose boards demand it.
Leslie, Charles has a comment in the chat box about, I think, the impact, could be the impact of the organization or the people in the organization. Charles, you want to speak to that?
Well, real quickly, I'm doing some leadership stuff with a foster parent aspect, and I'm getting the research I'm looking at. One of the aspects that is underreported and under-researched is the mental health role. That the mental health role, how the mental health role plays in our ability to lead. And I'm noticing that, when you look at Piaget and you look at these other theorists that talk about developmental theory, that it's a really important aspect to look at where the person behaves. And when you look at individuals who are in leadership and leadership positions, and you look at their behavior, you can track it back to being stuck in their child state, which directly affects their ability to lead as an adult or a parent. Yeah. So, too often we have these high expectations of individuals because of where they are, not recognizing or evaluating the behavior, because the behavior will tell you where they're stuck. And that's the reason, in most cases, that people aren't able, as Marty asked, to reach the level 5. Yeah. I think we have too high of optimistic expectations of individuals when in reality, being able to transform ourselves is damn difficult. Yes. And depending on the impact that happens to us as children, it's almost impossible. Yeah. And when we don't get any kind of mental health assistance, it will never happen.
Yeah. So that's a great point. There's a couple of ways that there are parallels between the work you're doing and some of this work. One is the ethics of how you work with people. So, for example, like those of us who do like executive coaching, we need to know if we're working with someone who's at like a socialized level, because then we have an undue amount of influence on their formation of identity. I don't know if anybody's bumped into that, but they talk about that in the immunity to change work. Like if they're socialized, they're looking to authority figures to tell them who they are. That's a lot of power to have, in this work. So yeah, it's really important. And the other thing that struck me is, I don't know how many of you work in leadership development, but this is a field where, you know, we typically start, especially in faith-based organizations, with leaders around this concept of formation, you know, and we encourage them to have a stage 4 way of looking at the world. Like, who are you? What are your values? What, like, this is you, you're the visionary leader. You know, you evoke confidence, you evoke followership. We don't help leaders develop a stage 5 identity.
And I think too, Leslie, we talk that talk, and that's what we want to see, but
Mhm.
the instructors don't support it. And
Yeah.
then for them to be successful and meet their goals each year to get their raises and be successful, they
Right.
have to be something else. And I think a lot of times it wasn't what they expected. I know for
Mhm.
clinicians and for administrators, when you go into healthcare, you're going into healthcare to help people.
Yeah.
And then you get in there and you don't have time to help people.
Right.
And so it's sort of a disconnect. And then that goes to what Charles was referring to, mental health issues. And it doesn't have to just come from childhood. It comes after we get into the structure.
Right.
So
Right.
Gary, I think we need a map. We need a systems map for this.
Well, you'll see the vestiges of that as Leslie keeps going through.
Okay,
Maybe
good.
not explicit, but let me just make a comment, Leslie, because this keeps coming up already.
Okay.
So this chart, if I understand, if I remember right, this really is reflecting some of the environment of the context.
Yes, this is the context.
Right.
Yeah.
And so just make a mental note of this as Leslie moves forward, that this is, if you think about this reflecting the role of the leader that these organizations actually inhabit, then you begin to think about who fills those roles and, you know, how those interact and what it determines about who can fill those roles. So I'll let you keep moving.
Yeah. And just to translate some of the little cryptic notes in there. So the issue of people versus profit, you know, and it wasn't just about getting bonuses. It's like, you know, do I close my whole obstetrics department in a border city that is serving an at-risk population because I can't make profit in obstetrics? You know, that if you look at it as a labor model, like, it's not profitable. So, but cardiac is super profitable. So now I'm, you know, now it starts to transcend from a systems view. You've crossed the boundary into public health, right? Like, we don't have safe obstetric care in this district that is serving an at-risk population because we can't make money at it. And those were some of the things. And then the collaborative piece was a positive piece. So, you know, that was like the anecdote, like when there was a ability to collaborate with the boss or the team or with others like the board in general, that was described as really positive and having a strong positive impact on the experience. The time perspective was just the short term, very, very short term, lots of pressure to make short term decision making. The power distribution had two themes. It was like either a few people had an inordinate amount of power, one or two people in a tens of thousands person organization, or you had them also being uninformed or unethical. So it was like, you know, they're making decisions without the right information, without the right moral compass. And then the decision process itself, like themes of feeling like, you know, there isn't a way to be able to have a robust decision process. So those were some of the dilemma themes. And in terms of how that like impacted people, you know, it was interesting. So as I looked at this classification of executives and, you know, where they were, it was interesting because the executives that were kind of still evolving into the stage 4 identity had more dilemmas around, or more not dilemmas. In understanding the dilemmas, it was more painful to them. It reflected, as they spoke about it, more on their sense of worth, on their confidence in themselves, in the sense of trust that they saw the system or others having of them, in the meaning that they constructed about themselves as leaders, and on their just belief in themselves. So this piece of identity was really interesting. It also, when you looked at the lower levels, it sort of made a case for you can't really operate as an executive at stage 3. You need that strength of conviction, to be an executive. Otherwise, it is eating away at morale and confidence and self-worth. And then the other things that came out, were that those who were at stage 4 were also later in their careers. So, I also felt like I got a little evolutionary snapshot of what the narrative sounds like for executives who are kind of still working through this transition, and those who have kind of like gotten further along and were more seasoned. So this is kind of the breakdown of where they were. The 4 with the /3 means that they are in an evolutionary stage, like there's still a lot of 3 behavior in, not behavior, but 3 perspective in how they see things. And then the 4 with the 3 in the parentheses means that they've transitioned to 4, but there's little remnants still of that 3 thinking. And then the 4 with no 3 means just 4. So that this is how the sample came out of the 8 executives. So because they, when you think about what a 3 is, a 3, it's like, I am because that's how you see me. They were much more dependent on boss. They were much more subject to power and authority for confidence, sense of worth. People, I was very touched. People were quite vulnerable, and saying things like, am I any good? Am I worth anything? And it was generally an earlier career position. The stable state 4, they were much less vulnerable, stronger sense of self, more integrative definition of self. And Gary led me to some of this research about, this concept of permeability. And so I referenced some of that in the summary. It's like, did they have a sense of self that was permeable so that environmental factors could change that view? Or were they less permeable? I almost thought about it as like, a cellular structure, like the permeability so that your cells absorb and whatnot. And it just felt like it was way less permeable. So when you think about what the implications are for that, how do you move from 4 to 5 when you've become so much less able to take in environmental inputs? And then all stages, really said that these values really strengthened their commitment to the way they thought, and they were crucible events. They were career-defining events for them, and that's consistent with, I don't know how many of you have read the HBR article about crucible events, but is consistent with the fact that leaders do really develop through these value dilemmas. So this is the thing, Marty, that you were asking about. When you looked at it systemically, kind of, this is the best way I could visualize it. And I think if I had one of those great, flowcharty minds, there would be a much more robust or rich picture of the dynamics. But it was this tension between feeling like they had to defend values, serve and protect their organization, with this demand from the system for action and obedience to these different factors of power, time, profit, and this sort of battle condition kind of, like it's coming at you, it's rapid fire. And the values that were referenced over and over were values of duties and values of leadership. The desire to serve, the value of integrity, the desire to be a steward, the values of leadership being justice and credibility, responsibility, collaboration, connection.
Leslie, I love this chart.
Oh, thank you. So I'll stop there. I can't read the text box, so I don't know if anybody's asking questions. I think this is a good place to stop.
I'm monitoring it. I think we're good. But with the text, the comment box. But anyone have questions? No. And Quasi's joined us, so he's add on to the group. Welcome, Quasi.
Hey,
Hi.
Quasi.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Just a quick question. With some of this, were any of these people affected by what is known as the imposter syndrome?
So that's a great question. And I chuckled because, you know, I am learning more about the immunity to change process. And one of the things I've learned is that for executives, that's one of the most common assumptions. You know, all of those limiting assumptions that are fear-based, which is like, if people really knew, they would know I'm not, you know, I'm an imposter. I'm not as good as I pretend. I didn't have any way to evaluate that in this. So it's a great question, and I would just be guessing at it. I know I suffer from it, but I don't know if they did.
Well, what I was wondering was, did any of them actually mention it without being asked?
No, it didn't come out that way. It came out, well, so could I say that I heard the language of the limiting assumptions that someone with the imposter syndrome has, like, I'm not as good? Yeah, I did. I heard phrases like, maybe I'm not right for the job, or maybe but it was more in the context of mutuality, like how they see me. Maybe my board won't think they've picked the right person. Maybe my team will be disappointed in me. It wasn't a statement of like how I see myself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I got one more little question. Sorry for this. Did any of them mention that they had a safe place, a safe harbor, that is someone they could confide in and talk to and articulate all these personal challenges?
Yeah, that's such a great question. It was not specifically mentioned, but it did come out as really important for that evolution from 3 to 4. So the way it came out was when they talked about the positive impact that having a sponsor, usually a boss, but it could be a board member, or sometimes it was their team, and how important that was and how defining that was. And so that's one of the conclusions I came away with, was like, we just don't do enough onboarding of executives. And when I say onboarding, like that could be anything, but really, you know, like helping them navigate what that transition really looks like, how to do it, providing mentoring, safe space, all of that. You know, I can't, I can just say when I work with executives, it's very rare to see a robust onboarding program for the transition into an executive team. It's kind of part of how the system treats them. Like, you know, like you're an executive, you don't need it. Yeah. And then Keegan talks a lot about how painful that transition from 3 to 4 is. Like that it's really a very difficult and painful transition. And I think I heard that a lot. I heard people referencing dilemmas that weren't even ones that were happening recently, but they were going back to when they were younger in their career, and how painful it was to like feel alone, like there was nobody there to support them. Yeah. So those are the ways it came out. I'm curious if you're seeing, I know you just finished your research too. Was there anything similar to that in what you heard?
interesting. I just had the meeting with the site medical executive director. I just presented to him before the executive next week. And he raised the very point where he identified to other physicians, hey, you know, you have leadership skills. And they almost blanched. And it was about fear of standing out from amongst their peers because you would then become personally vulnerable. And we talked about there's ways to deal with this, and the fact that one, medical school as leaders doesn't help them, and I think even with us as health administrators, we don't do what we're supposed to do in terms of orientate ourselves to our roles or our roles vis-a-vis the structures within which we work. There is this assumption that because we've done these master's programs that we've all done our personal work, and that to me is quite frankly one of the biggest tragedies of preparation for leading others is people's reach exceeds their grasp.
Well, that's a great way of putting it. Yeah.
And I have a question from Charles. Charles, you want to ask a question?
I was just thinking, you know, people rate themselves, and it's always interesting when I see ratings that people do of themselves that I then sit back and go, well, they say they're a 3. I think they're a 4. I think they're a 2. I was wondering, since you knew these people, did you see them as how they rated themselves, or would you rate them differently?
So a couple of things. That's a great question. One of the things about the subject-object interview is they don't rate themselves. In fact, they don't even know they're being rated. So, so it's a very much like a dialogue. I would say to you, think about, you know, this dilemma and reflect on these emotions and make some notes to yourself about how you experience those emotions. And they would be things like anger and fear and winning and things of that sort. And then we would just have a conversation. And I would ask you to describe that. And I would ask you questions like, so what was the anger about? And they might say, you know, well, I knew there was no way I could win. Well, why was winning important? Until I started to come to language that the person used to describe their thinking about themselves. Well, if I can't win, then the board won't have confidence in me. Why is it, you know, what is it, what would happen if the board didn't have confidence? Well, everyone would know that I wasn't good for the job. Well, that's a very socialized way. And so, you know, I would just capture, you know, these were all recorded and transcribed. So I would capture those bits in the language, and then we would use the scoring protocol to say, what about that is a level 3? What about that is a level 4? And, you know, so it was all scored by me, but described by them. And that also made me a little uncomfortable. It's part of the reason I haven't probably finished the white paper is like, I feel a little uncomfortable to have them know that I was scoring. I don't know, Gary, you're smiling at me, but
Well, I would think they know there has to be some analysis technique, or you
right.
don't have analysis. But
right.
And was it all interview narrative, or did they do any writing?
It was, they wrote notes, which I did not collect. So the way the protocol goes, you have to give them time to reflect. So if you're in person, you give them these prompts on 3x5 cards with these emotions. Since we were not, I sent it to them ahead of time and asked them to think about it. And then I gave them more time in the interview. So I actually waited while they jotted their notes down. And then I did not collect their notes. It was just there for them. So you have to, I think it was at least 10 minutes in that 90 minutes, at least 10 minutes of time was to really let them have thought time. And some of them took way less than that.
Okay.
Yeah.
You had mentioned writing earlier, and I just want to clarify.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Any other questions?
Well, I think you need to do the white paper. I think.
Thank you. Say more. What were you going to say?
No, that's what I was going to say. Who else was?
Oh.
There is a lot of places where, I mean, we've used Keegan and Leahy up here in some of our development stuff with our leaders, etc. And there's a lot of stuff here that overlaps with, resonates with some of the research I did in the reality of healthcare. What was interesting in what you described were, there are a couple of factors that aren't experienced in the Canadian system. One is the profit motive that you mentioned, and I can't remember what the other one was if you go back to the slide, but I was surprised at how similar some of the challenges were and what some of the experiences these people are having, but two of what I would consider major variables in the cultures, the environments in which they work, were not present, but there's still an incredible amount of similarity. That to me was an interesting curiosity.
Yeah. What do you make of that?
I'm not sure. I'm one. This piece of me that just says we're human, and we will experience these, the conditions of the frailties of the human condition. So that's universal. But the stuff that is contextually based, that is the situations in which we each work, I'm surprised at how much commonality there seems to be, given the uniqueness we all. So maybe there's something there where, and I like to say this, but I fear saying it out loud often, and that is, we're all unique, but we're all the same.
Right. Well, it's, and it also, anecdotally points to some of the things that are, I would call it like the fallout that is universal in healthcare, not just in the USA. So, burnout, like it just, to me, was so descriptive of that. And the quality issues, the number of errors, and, so it's like it does make a case for this systemic conditions, and you put human beings into those and they will respond, predictably.
So Leslie, I wonder if some of that similarity is coming from the medical culture itself. Having put my ex-husband through medical school and residency, that whole culture, it's based on a military model, and extremely hierarchical. And so I wonder if that's somewhat where the similarities come from, even though Canada and the US have different systems. There's similarity in the training. And I realize that probably not all the executives had been through medical training, but I'm sort of assuming that a number of them have. But even if you haven't, you're in that culture.
Right. I think one of the 8 that I spoke to was an executive who was also a physician. The other 7 were administrators. And there is a different culture, administrative culture, than there is medical culture. And what's so interesting is that they're the smartest people. I mean, smart people. And they were able to appreciate complexity. And I kept thinking, my original want was to try to do something that was more design-based, which was to take some people and just give them an opportunity to do some design around what it could be versus what it is. Because my inspiration around that was noticing that, these same executives and these same physicians who were burning out from a lot of these dynamics would go do medical missions and come back like fulfilled, happy. And those were missions where like they're literally, the nurses and doctors are like, they're literally having to take like pens and take the ink out of it and use it as tubing, and they don't have antibiotics, like where they're just, They don't have any of the luxury. It's much worse. You could say much worse, but it doesn't have any of those, or the impact of those dynamics weren't getting them like they do in the institutional models. So I thought, oh, that'd be so interesting to figure out, like, how do you do it differently? This is for great design thinkers, because I can't answer that question right now. I wish I could. And the other, piece of the medical mission is there's no electronic health record. So I don't know if that came up, Kwesi, in your research. I sure get an earful about that.
Leslie, was there any sense of, so you looked at a single dilemma or how they reacted to a dilemma, but
yes,
given a 30-day period, how often did they feel like they were in some sort of critical dilemma? I mean, that would speak to the stress level that leads to burnout and all of that. And I just wondered if there was a sense of that.
I can't answer that, because I didn't answer it. So I can't answer it from this content. I can just tell you anecdotally, my experience is that it's ongoing. And the thing that changed as they went from like level 3 to level 4 was their confidence and shorthand in managing them, which also continues to strengthen that level 4. It's like there's this efficiency in doing it the way I know how to do it,
right.
And not learning it differently, because now what was early in my career like really difficult and painful, I can just handle quickly and easily. That I observed, but I can't tell you how often they come up. That's a great question.
Leslie, just quick question. One of the things I thought of was a couple of things. The applicability of this and the overlap with a lot of stuff that we're both doing, and Deanna and others, is how much time did these leaders, if any, spend on a weekly basis or daily on reflection? And that is self-reflection, that is, how am I being relative to who I am in terms of my values? How am I being in terms of what I set myself out as showing up in this way? Did any of that self-reflection go on at all?
I can't answer that from the data, but I can sideways answer it. So there's a book that also really got me thinking about this called Tricky Coaching. And it was a book that is written by a German author based on his interactions with executives and some of the tricky things that they're dealing with, which were a lot of these things. So it's not answering the question, did they have a place for reflection, but it answers the question, when they do, what kind of themes come up. When I saw that, I thought, I want to learn more about that. So I can't say whether they have that space. I do think this is my opinion that I don't have data for, but I do think a number of executives use their executive coaches for that purpose. They use the executive coaching relationship as that safe space to reflect, etc. And this book, Tricky Coaching, was illustrative of what comes up there. And it's pretty, and I'm doing executive coaching too right now. And, my sense is that's one of the greatest reasons that it's being used is it's a safe space. There isn't a lot of safety.
Did all of these participants have a coach, executive coach?
I don't know. I didn't ask. So some of them I knew from my previous role, and they agreed to participate because they knew me. Some of them I had never met before, or I had just met tangentially. One woman who agreed to participate, who was in the Carolinas, I had given a complimentary seat to a program that I ran when I was an executive. And so I just reached out to her and said, would you be willing to participate? So I didn't know them well enough. The ones that I did know well, I could tell you were probably 3, and 2 of them had worked with an executive coach.
So Leslie, this is the last slide. I didn't know if you were.
Let me see. Yeah, so these were kind of like the implications, that executives who are at evolutionary transitional stages of self-authoring, that their thoughts and identity were really embedded in the thoughts and perceptions of others, and they had a tendency to have more polarized thinking, less tolerance for ambiguity and criticism, greater dependence on an external authority. I think I already talked about that. And so the recommendations for development were, I already said, mentorship and onboarding, but also this whole work of dialogic development, the art of dialogue, the ability to suspend certainty, the work of learning to examine your own assumptions, the immunity to change work, all of that like really fits nicely as great developmental tools. And then executives who were at a stable or self-authoring stage compared to their counterparts, they experienced their dilemmas as more systemic, more complex. They were more likely to craft roles that integrated the complexity, and they were more likely to use their own identity to respond to dilemmas, even to the detriment of their own health, I had to add, because the burnout came out as a factor, especially for the 4s. One person sharing that their health was at risk and that they almost recently would have missed a diagnosis that would have caused them to die. Another one sharing having had a stroke and returning to work the next day. So those sorts of things. So the recommendation developmentally there was, ways to test some of their self-authored assumptions, like what you were saying, Kwesi, about only I can fix this, or it's all up to me, I'm all alone. Building more communities. I think Keegan and Leahy, they've evolved their thinking now to these deliberately developmental organizations to try to create more community and more spaces for people to challenge their thinking and to grow. I also think there's a great opportunity to use the subject-object interview as a coaching tool. And that was just based on my experience working with Kay in practicing it, and then also having it done for me. It's like I had so many insights about myself just going through as a participant in that.
That's what I was thinking mostly as you were describing it. I could see it totally being a tool.
Yeah. And there is a small community of people out there who are using it that way. And then, none of them constructing meaning at the self-transforming stage. So that, the experience of value dilemma just seemed to strengthen the commitment to values and didn't yield the kind of thinking that challenged a self-authored ideology. And that piece is the recommendation for, broader ecosystem design. Not just having communities so you're not alone, but communities that in a broader ecosystem, many thinkers from different vantage points, yielding a multi-system view. And so I'm really excited by the idea of learning communities where people, can look at these issues, but not just from one vantage point, from many vantage points.
So to that last point, Leslie, one of the things that I think I remember from the discussion in your defense call, I didn't just make this up, was the question about levels versus the context of the organization. So, there's assumption, I think, by people who work on leadership that higher is better on whatever scale it is, right? But the fit of a particular type of leadership relative to the organization itself, I think often has a lot of bearing. And so there are some organizations where, to come in too close to self-authoring is going to, create an immediate immunity response. Now, the organization will not tolerate that because it just doesn't fit. They aren't looking for that. And if you come in if you're operating too far from the culture of the organization, then, you might make some movement with the organization, but that's a high, tough road.
Yeah.
Another part of this is a question about levels of leadership in the executive rank versus the board.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've got someone who might potentially be working at a level 5, an unusual circumstance, but there's nobody at the board level who's operating at that level, then you can imagine the kind of clash.
Yep.
If you've got someone who is, say, the chair or the head of the board who's operating at a self-authoring level, but has an executive that might be, more of a 4, and they can mentor and work with them, then you've got a really different situation.
Yep.
So just thinking about the fit of the different leadership roles within the context of an organization,
Right.
I think has some potential value.
Absolutely. That's so well said, Gary, and I really appreciate you doing that. One of the most amazing, beautiful things about being in school is being able to keep looking and researching and testing. And early on in my own organization, while I was doing some of the practicum work, I did an action research study on, what the immunities were to change. So, what was really clear is that dynamic that you're describing, Gary, which is like these gung-ho self-authoring leaders coming in and then bumping into these immune systems of just hunker down because, the average C-level executives, maybe 2 to 4 years, and we've written 6 of them out already, but don't, just hunker down, or else, it was either status quo or it was, fear-based, don't try it because if you do it and, it's the wrong thing, you'll have wasted your energy. So, yeah, I think that's a really interesting thing. I would love to see more examination of that dynamic.
Have a critical access hospital.
Leslie and Gary, good points you make. That one of the questions that I always ask when someone goes into an executive position, particularly when one is leading an organization, I always ask, what is it they're being asked to do? Are they basically asked to maintain the status quo because the organization is functioning at a level that everybody's happy at and someone's just retiring? Is it to build, reconstruct because we're performing really horribly? Is it to expand or is it to destroy? And so I've always asked, what's the role at a very kind of basic level? How do you perceive the role that the board has hired you to do? Is it to build? And is it to change? Are you a change agent? Mm-hmm. And how well has that been articulated by the board to the rest of the executive? And then from the new person in and the rest of the members of the leadership team to the organization, this is what we're about to do, and these are the reasons why. Right. Because one of the things I always struggle with is when organizations undertake change, we do an incredibly interesting job of articulating, 1, the context, and 2, if we're going to a future disaster state, why we're going there. I'm always fascinated as how do we start and expect to undertake change and don't articulate it clearly and listen to the questions, fears, anxieties of the people who are going to be affected before we get on the horse and start riding. It's always a curiosity to me.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating. And, in terms of the board, I had one great example of what you were describing, Gary, which was like a supportive mentoring, where the board made all the difference. Because the board was operating at a higher level than the executive was. I also had an example where the board was operating at a lower level, where it was a public district hospital. The board was elected, and they were operating way below where the executive was, and it was just, it made me want to start to lobby for legislature that requires board certification, because it's like this is ridiculous, So it was interesting. The board's role was really critical. The other thing that's really interesting that's happening that's different than Canada, that is something that I'm just learning more about in my current role is, you say, we say that physician culture is different than administrative culture. There is a huge movement right now in the US, because healthcare still is such a huge percentage of our GDP and there's so much money in it, is that, private equity firms are purchasing physician practices. So, to say that the physicians can operate differently and, and autonomously, they really can't. They are under huge pressures now, to meet those equity firm requirements. And from the physician standpoint, I've talked to a number of physicians who feel really commoditized by it. It's like they just, and they're vulnerable because they don't know much about business. Some of them do, but in general, that's not taught. So, the appeal of the equity firm and the equity control and governance and all that seems good and profitable, and then it drives a lot of the same dynamics that the administrators are working with. Another system.
Yeah, it's a very complex phenomenon.
Yeah.
For sure.
I
Well,
think that's,
we're
yeah.
down to the bottom of the hour, and we really appreciate, and I think we probably all have more and more questions, and we have a lot of thoughts. I know I do, thoughts going on in my head. But we did record it, and I'll send it out to everyone that registered to attend. We have a couple people that weren't able to make it, but they registered. And you'll also get a copy of the chat box. And any last parting words for Leslie?
This is great, Leslie.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, it's in some ways not surprising, and in some ways very revealing. But yeah, you're done good.
Awesome.
Thank you, Gary. Give Gary the credit because he saw me at various stages of 3 and below.
Leslie, definitely you are not at 3 and below now.
Yeah.
Absolutely not.
Yeah. This was your study, absolutely, Leslie, and it was really well done. Really commendable.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Hey, Leslie, I made a comment earlier on and that is, there is so much opportunity, I think, for cooperative research, future research going forward, that I'm looking forward to the discussions we're having as a subgroup. So nice stuff, good stuff. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great.
Yeah.
Bye, everybody. Have a good week.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.